If you haven't realized yet, I quite like Warhammer. I like Warhammer Fantasy, I hate Age of Sigmar, and I love Warhammer 40k specifically. The idea of simple, regular humans fighting fiercely against the horrors of an uncaring galaxy is extremely appealing to me. So is it really surprising that I love Helldivers 2 too? Not really, no. In fact, it is absolutely unsurprising to me how much the Warhammer community loves Helldivers 2. The vibe is pretty much the same. But honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg when you consider Helldivers 2's popularity. The core of the matter is that the game is simply fun. The gameplay loop is genuinely great, the graphics look absolutely amazing, and even the supposedly worst aspects of the game, like the in-game store, are done in such a way that attracts very little criticism. I would even say this is probably the first in-game store I've seen that doesn't nickel and dime the player base, treating them as little more than a walking wallet. Considering I'm a Warhammer fan that has grown accustomed to being manhandled by Games Workshop and their garbage business practices, this is a real breath of fresh air. Especially considering that there are other successful games like Destiny 2 and Halo Infinite that utilize absolutely garbage business practices, it only makes Helldivers 2 have an even more positive look, at least in my eyes. What I mean to say with all of this talk is, Helldivers 2 is essentially lightning in a bottle, the same way Destiny once was, and in this case, I believe the overwhelming amount of success is completely warranted. Even the CEO of Arrowhead Game Studios seems to genuinely enjoy what he does. He seems to really love making video games for others to enjoy. And I really think that we desperately need such leaders in the gaming industry because lately we really have been saturated by nothing but pure, undiluted garbage with very few actual good products. Yes, I truly think that Baldur's Gate 3 is also one of the few exceptions, and this comes as absolutely no surprise to anyone when you consider that the CEO of Larian Studios also loves making games. In fact, I strongly recommend that you guys play Divinity Original Sin 2. It has probably one of the most fun combat systems I've ever experienced in a CRPG, but that's a little besides the point. That being said, this video isn't a game review. I just wanted to remind you people that the success this game has experienced is completely deserved, and that even though they did indeed make a mistake, we shouldn't really throw everything in the trash, especially since our voices were heard, and Sony did indeed backtrack on their ridiculous decision. So let's get into the whole situation now, and how exactly the community ball-busted Sony and managed to force them to reverse a horrible anti-consumer decision. So in case you've been living under a rock and haven't heard about the recent drama regarding Sony and Helldivers 2, I'll give the abridged version. Basically, during launch, Helldivers 2 experienced some really egregious server issues. You could also experience some bugs, but I believe the main problem was the crashes that happened after missions, and most importantly, the servers being at capacity for a considerable amount of time, preventing people from being able to log on and actually play the game. Several solutions were implemented to fix this issue. They had to dedicate more servers to it, but most importantly for our conversation today, they allowed the PlayStation Network connection to be optional, at least until they managed to completely fix those issues with the server. So this was something that was always baked into the game from the beginning, with even the CEO of Arrowhead stating that he knew about it 6 months before the game was even released. This was also always on the Steam page for everyone to see, but people just didn't really pay any attention to it. There are several problems with this, however. Firstly, people on the internet absolutely loathe feeling pushed into a corner, and because so many people bought the game without ever being aware of these conditions, this change, even if it was telegraphed, made them feel like the ground was shifting beneath them, and their reaction was, of course, absolutely nuclear. Personally, I hate this disgusting practice of having to log on to 1,000 different launchers just to play a game. It is extremely inconvenient, bad for performance, and also kind of intrusive. But I believe the main issue was there are countries where the PlayStation Network is simply unavailable. This is a massive issue because there were no limitations during launch which prevented these countries from buying the game, which means that this change could very well harm those players that do not have any access to PSN. I don't know if it was Valve's response or Sony itself, but someone went absolutely scorched earth on this issue, making the game unavailable for purchase in these affected countries, which honestly just fanned the flames of discontent in people's hearts. During this absolute shitstorm, people took to the official Discord server to complain, understandably so, and what they heard from the community managers wasn't particularly reassuring. In fact, you could say the community managers and even Arrowhead Studios itself were completely blindsided by this utterly vitriolic response. They were of course already aware that the linking of accounts was going to be a requirement eventually, but they failed to properly convey this issue to the players. The resulting situation was probably one of the worst exchanges between a fan base and community managers that I've ever seen. People were understandably mad, but at the same time, there are always going to be those who go too far. After all, you can't properly control a mad group of people. There are always going to be bad apples, malicious people who are simply toxic and wish to poison the conversation. But to be fair, the community manager's reaction wasn't particularly stellar either, so the whole situation was just completely miserable for everybody involved. They had no answer to the concerned players, people who were directly affected by these stupid new changes, and of course, this lack of reliability just made people even more mad. I am, of course, on the side of the consumers on this one. In fact, I believe there were some mistakes made by the community managers, which I'll get into in a second. But first, I should say that, under any circumstances, it isn't okay to send death threats to people or even tell them to harm themselves or something similar. Some lines should not be crossed under any conditions. There should be some level of understanding and civility on our part as consumers, and besides that, this kind of behavior isn't just unhelpful, it is completely unacceptable. That being said, there was some awful behavior on the part of the community managers too. Some people received well-deserved bans, but they also banned folks for engaging in the conversation and simply being mad about the decisions made, which isn't a particularly good look. There was also the issue related to the reasoning behind the account linking in the first place. They said this could be a positive thing and would be used to better regulate and ban individuals who are toxic and stuff like that. Basically, they said this would be used as a tool for better moderation. But honestly, I personally think this is completely wrong for two reasons. The first one is obviously that Steam has no problem banning individuals that break the terms of service. And the second one is that I sincerely doubt that anything Sony does is for the sake of the consumers. This was obviously done to pad their numbers, with little regard for the actual consequences, and as such, I am very glad it has completely blown up in their faces. By this point, people were already review bombing the game, hoping that Sony would reverse their decision. Although there was indeed a community manager who warned the fan base that the only way to make their voices heard would be through something like this, I believe that by this point, the genie was already out of the bottle and the pitchforks and torches were already in hand. After all, this isn't the first review bomb campaign, and I would say it was also completely justified. The result of this was probably the greatest and fastest review bombing I've ever seen a game receive. Public opinion had completely turned against Sony at this point, and because of the situation regarding the countries that don't have access to the PlayStation Network, Steam started accepting all refunds. This was probably to protect themselves, considering that the possibility of legal trouble would be considerable if Sony went through with their decision. Now Sony was bleeding goodwill, trust, and worst of all, they were bleeding money. After realizing that the situation was just completely against them, they decided to do the sensible thing and give up on pushing these changes through. I guess they simply didn't want the smoke, which they really shouldn't. And that's basically the end of it. The good guys won, and the corporation lost. Hopefully they aren't plotting something even stupider next. To be honest, I was somewhat afraid that something like this would eventually happen, the second I heard that Sony were their publishers. But I really hope that they just shut up and let Arrowhead do their own thing now. They have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to win. Anyways, that's it. This is a bit different from the usual stuff I make, but I feel like if I have a YouTube channel, I might as well give my opinion on things from time to time. That being said, I'm working on a crossover video about Helldivers and Warhammer 40k next, so hopefully you guys will enjoy that too. See you later.